for an intermediate state. We looked at Matthew chapter 10 and verse 28 that emphasizes the soul and the body can exist separately. We looked at Luke 16, where we're looking at it now, rather, and the story of the rich man and Lazarus. Now, I say story of the rich man and Lazarus on purpose. A lot of people call it the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. And I don't think it's a parable. Now, some people believe that it is. I don't. And one of the reasons, by the way, some people dismiss almost anything that's in it. They say, well, you really can't, come to any firm conclusions about the intermediate state by this because it's just a parable. Well, a couple of things. First of all, like I said, I'm not convinced it's a parable at all. Number one, Jesus doesn't, it's not introduced as a parable. But another important thing is there are no other parables where people are named. Usually when it's a parable, it's always there was a farmer, there was, and you have that kind of introduction to it. Whereas here you have, a proper name mentioned. I think this really is that Jesus has chosen two historical people. But even if it is, let's just for a minute say for argument's sake, it is a parable. To dismiss it as a parable completely misses the point. Because every parable reflects a realistic situation, whether it's a wedding feast, whether it's lost sheep, whether it's sowing and harvesting, whether it's fishing. The circumstances of every parable is true. Parables weren't set in fantasy worlds, and that's really important to understand. And so even if these two people aren't historical and real, and I think they are, but even if they're not, the circumstances and the setting is real. And so, so at the very least, as we look at this and as we read it, Jesus is confirming some real important realities about what happens after we die. And again, one of those is clearly, there's a lot of things we can't say, and there's a lot of things that is said here that really sparks speculation and questions that we probably can't come to any real definitive conclusion, but there's some things that are definitive here. And one of those is both of these guys were clearly conscious immediately after they died. They knew where they were conscious of their surroundings, and so the dead clearly exists in a conscious interim state. Look at Luke 23. We mentioned this one earlier. Let's stay in Luke. Luke chapter 23. Look at verse 42. Of course, this is, as we said a minute ago, or in the last session, the moment of the moment of the crucifixion, and one of the thieves on the cross, thieves there, asked Jesus, "Remember me when you come in your kingdom." Now, a lot of times people ask, does he understand the nature of Jesus? Wow, I'm impressed by that question that he even asked. Even the apostles didn't understand the real nature at this point of Jesus' kingdom. And, did he understand what Jesus was talking, or did he understand the nature of Jesus' kingdom when he asked this? And I don't think so. I mean, like I said, if he understands the nature of Jesus' kingdom that was going to be established, then he had a deeper insight than the apostles did or anyone else at that time. And so I don't think that's, I don't think he understood the spiritual nature of Jesus' kingdom. I think he was probably just using it. He understood the kingdom of Messiah like a lot of Jews understood the kingdom of Messiah in those days. And he probably assumed that somehow this was going to inaugurate Jesus as the Messiah reigning immediately. But whatever his understanding of it, he's clearly asking for a blessing. He's clearly demonstrating repentance. He's seeking the blessings of Christ. And Jesus responds to him. And he says there in verse 43, Jesus said to him, "Truly, I say to you, today you shall be with me in paradise." And so, as I said a minute ago, we won't kind of linger on it. Just the very word paradise implies a state of consciousness and awareness. Because how could anything be described as a paradise or a blessing if it's not consciously experienced? You have to be able to consciously experience something. I'm going to guess, if I were to say to Leola, hey, hon, listen, if you die before me, would you like me to take your body before it is, before we bury it? Would you like me to take your body, prop it up in the SUV, and let's take one more road trip across America? It's going to be fun. I promise. It's going to be great. What do you think? Is that okay?
You may not like the smell.
I may not like the smell. Listen, she's never turned down a road trip before. You know, we're travel buddies and travel partners, and we just love exploring the world together. But obviously, she's not too enthused about that prospect. And there's a reason why. No matter how much I insist that it's going to be fun, she knows it won't be fun, because you can't describe something as fun unless you consciously experience it. You have to be aware of things, and she knows at that moment of the corpse propped up in the passenger seat, she's not experiencing any fun. That corpse doesn't have conscious existence. Now, in another state, she has conscious existence. That's what we're talking about. But so just to describe something as paradise, today you'll be with me in paradise. That implies awareness. And you have to be able to consciously experience something before you can even label it as paradise. And so this is another really important passage that emphasizes consciousness after death. Again, what point would these words be if at death the thief would be totally unaware of his surroundings? What point would these words make? But Jesus is telling him today, the very day that my body is going to be in a tomb, you and I are going to be having fellowship together. That's what Jesus is saying. We're going to experience fellowship, and it's going to be paradise. And so you can't experience fellowship unless you consciously are aware of your surroundings. Again, if you lay a bunch of unconscious people out, they're not aware of being in fellowship with each other. You have to consciously experience. With me makes no sense. So with me in paradise, very, very important words. So they're going to continue to exist in a disembodied state. The body's going to be buried, and Jesus' body is going to continue to be buried till Sunday. And but they're still going to be today, Friday, they're going to be together, and they're going to be in paradise. And so there is the emphasis there of that intermediate state. Then you have things like Philippians chapter 2. Turn over to Philippians chapter 1. Philippians chapter 1. Paul's writing here. This is another passage that's really familiar to most of us. And he says, beginning in verse 21, he says, "For to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain." Okay, first of all, just think about that. He says, okay, I gain something when I die. So there's genuinely something that is going to be gained. And then so he's saying, look, if I die, I win. It's going to be, I'm getting something. And in verse 22, but if I am to live on in this present world or in the flesh, this will mean fruitful labor for me. And I do not know which to choose. So he says, but if I stay right here and if I keep living in the flesh, I know it's going to be productive. God's going to use me. There's purpose, there's meaning to his work, and there's going to be value. And he says, but I don't know what to choose, because he also knows that death is going to bring something great. And then he says this in verse 23, but I am hard pressed from both directions, having a desire to depart and be with Christ, for that is very much better. So by the inspiration of the Spirit, you see this connection, this very close connection here between departing and being with Christ. Having a desire to depart and be with Christ. Those two things go together. That's what happened. He's letting us know that what happens when we depart, that means die in the context. Well, it means we're going to be with Christ. We're not going to be unconscious. I'm going to be with Christ. And again, being with Christ implies consciousness, because it would make no sense to say you're going to be with Christ if you don't know it and you're not aware of it and you can't experience that fellowship. And so departing means immediately being in fellowship with Christ. And he says that is going to be far better. Now, if the soul sleep view were true, that our souls remain completely unconscious of our surroundings and we're not aware of anything, how in the world can that be described as being better than having consciousness of our fellowship with Christ here? I don't know how it could be. Now, at least in this life, which is completely sin-infected, I understand that. But at least in this life, we have awareness of Christ and fellowship with Christ and the love of Christ and all of the stuff that relationship with Christ brings. To say then that being completely unaware of our surroundings is better than that makes no sense. Again, the only way that this can be better, our state after death will be better than now, is because you got to be aware of making the comparison. There's got to be an awareness. There's got to be a consciousness. And so the very fact that he says that it's going to be better if he dies is clear implication of the intermediate state. Yes, sir.
Right. Surely there's one situation where he would be better off dead than well, apparently most people think anyway, than being alive. But as if say you're in a state of total agony, in life, in the ordinary life.
Yeah.
Because then the cessation of agony.
Yeah, absolutely. Listen, no matter what our quality of life is here, there it's going to be far better. It's always going to be far better. But what you said reminded me of, the Christian perspective of death ought to be, but I got to be honest with you, I'm sometimes troubled by what I see. Now, I understand the human condition, and I'm a human being, and I bleed red, and death is awful, and separation is just unconscionable. I can't even imagine. I don't even like to wrap my mind and ponder trying to go on with life without Leola. But with all that said, I sometimes am troubled by how desperately Christians try to hold on to life. Now listen, I want to hold on to life as long as I can. I do. God put me here, and even though we live in a broken world, there's so many aspects of this world that are just so amazing by God's design. It's a beautiful world. We have friendships and we have fellowships and meaningful work, and God designed me for this world, and there's just so many blessings, and I want to stay around and enjoy those blessings as long as I can. I do. And so I get that. But at the same time, I absolutely believe what's been revealed, that it is far better. And so even though I want to stay here and I want to continue to have the present fellowship and experience with my wife and family and friends and all as long as I can, I'm not afraid of dying because I believe it really is far better. And I've told my daughter, I've told my wife repeatedly, listen, you listen to me. Do not go to extraordinary, don't try to keep my body pumping if it is inevitable. Well, let me just let me go be with Jesus, okay? I'm good with that. I'm good with that. Leola's dad died in November. About 6 months ago, he passed away, and he had been in the hospital for the last 8 months, and it was in a Veterans Administration hospital in Nashville, and they were so wonderful, and when the time came, and she misses him, and her mom misses him and everything. But that was one of those moments where there was he was not ever going to get better. And it was just a slow decline. And well, it actually was a pretty rapid decline. Yeah. But there were tears when that moment came and he died. But man, at the same time, we were, it was a blessing. It was good. It was good. I hated seeing him like that. And I knew what was in store. He was a child of God and had preached the gospel for 50 years. And just a beautiful heart, and just loved Jesus and his word and his people. And so we knew it was a great moment. It was a great moment. It was a painful moment because there's a hole in the heart. And we have to remember that Paul says, he says, we don't grieve, and we'll be looking at this in a minute. We don't grieve like those who have no hope. He didn't say we don't grieve. We grieve, but we grieve differently. Because, as the world grieves, they haven't, death is it. It's it. And they sometimes so desperately, to excessive moments, cling to life. My daughter's an ICU nurse, an intensive care nurse. And she says, Dad, sometimes it's just so frustrating. The doctors, we will tell, there's absolutely nothing. There's nothing that can be done. Nothing at all. And I mean, zero. There is no hope at all. And, and yet family members will say, I don't care. You do keep doing everything that you can to just keep that body alive. You just do everything you can. You do not stop anything. And I guess if I was of the world, I don't know. I'm not even sure I'd want to do that even if I was of the world. But I guess I can see why some people in the world are like that, because that's all they have. This is it. And but we know better. God's revealed to us that it is far better. That moment when Frank died in November the 9th, that very moment, he was released from that old broken body that was completely, he had no mobility at all. He had a permanent colostomy, and just what he couldn't pull himself up in bed. He couldn't do it. He just, that old broken body had just, he couldn't go anywhere. I mean, he was confined, and his mind had then begun to deteriorate. And but that very moment that he died, things changed dramatically in ways that I can only imagine right now and just take on faith. But immediately, it is far better to depart and to be with Christ, he says. So that's what Paul says. What happened to him immediately? Well, I think what happened to him is this. I think what happened to him, and we were back in Luke 16, what happened when Lazarus died? What does the text say there? What happened the moment that Lazarus died? He was taken where? By what or by whom? He was taken to Abraham's side. By angels. That's what I was looking for. He was taken by angels. When people ask about, what do we know about the angelic world, the spirit world, the world of spirit people, angels, and what is the work that they do? Generally the Hebrew writer describes them as ministering servants, and so whatever way that God chooses to use them to minister, there's probably a wide variety of ways, and we see some of those ways in Scripture. But one toward God's people is you see. At death, angels accompany the soul. I think it's reasonable to think that that's the norm, and that at the moment that Frank passed away, and some of your loved ones who knew Christ, that at that moment they saw angels, and they were taken to be with Christ in paradise, which is far better. And so the intermediate state, the clear teaching of Scripture that at death, what happens immediately after we die? We continue to consciously exist. Our souls immediately are in fellowship with Christ, and that is far better. It is, in the words of Jesus himself, it is paradise. It is paradise. Questions, comments, observations on any of that? We got a couple more verses to look at, but I'll pause for a minute if you want to say anything. All right, let's look at 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 then. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. We read this a little earlier, 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. Verses 13 through 18. God is going to grace us again with a glimpse of what happens after we die. But we do not want you to be uninformed, verse 13, brethren, about those who are asleep, so that you will not grieve as do the rest who have no hope. Grieving is okay, man, and grief is one of those things, as many of you know, that you can't really put a stopwatch on it. Sometimes you have to put a calendar on it. And people grieve in different ways, and for different, different periods of time. We grieve. We love people, and but as we grieve, we don't grieve like those who have no hope. And he says, "For if we believe that Jesus died and rose again, and we do, even so, God will bring with him those who have fallen asleep in Jesus." Now, notice that. He will bring with him those who have fallen asleep. Everything that we've seen confirms what this says, that all those who die in Christ are with him. And so when Jesus comes again, they are going to accompany Jesus. And he says, "For this we say to you by the word of the Lord, that we who are alive and remain until the coming of the Lord will not precede those who have fallen asleep. The Lord will descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of the archangel, with the trumpet of God. The dead in Christ will rise first." There's the bodies coming back. And again, we're going to get into resurrection a little bit later. "Then we who are alive and remain will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and so we shall always be with the Lord." It emphasizes resurrection, of course, also. But what I wanted you to see is that he will bring with him those who have fallen asleep. So again, clear implication that they are in fellowship with Christ. And again, that is confirmed by Luke 23 and Luke 16. So those are really important passages to think about. We're going to come back to this passage, by the way, when we talk about what's our existence going to be like in the intermediate state. And we'll do that here in a little bit, probably right after lunch. We'll get into, okay, what's that going to be like when we're there. Look at, though, Hebrews chapter 12. Let's look at one more, another one. Hebrews chapter 12. Hebrews chapter 12. When you get there, take a look at verse 22. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 22. The Hebrew writer is telling these Christians. Let me kind of give you a little bit of background, first of all, on Hebrews, really super quick. This is being written to Jews who have become Christians, but persecution has been so overwhelming that they are thinking about leaving Christ and going back to Judaism. And the Hebrew writer is emphasizing, no. You leave Christ, you leave your only hope. The law of Moses, the old covenant, was temporary stop along the way to the permanent covenant that God would use to bless humanity. And you can't go back to that. That was never God's permanent covenant to relate and bless humanity, to relate to humanity and bless them. So, and so he's making this contrast here between what he calls Sinai and Zion. The old covenant was Sinai, and the new covenant is Mount Zion. So he says, and he uses a lot of Old Testament imagery here. And so let's kind of skip down to verse 22. Verses 18 through 21, he's kind of referring to Mount Zion, but he says, verse 22, or Mount Sinai, verse 22, but you have come to Mount Zion. And he says, and to the city of the living God, and to myriads of angels, or if you've got the NIV, thousands upon thousands of angels, to the general assembly and church of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven, and to God, the judge of all, and to the spirits of the righteous made perfect. So every Christian, he says, is saying, is we have full citizenship in a domain that includes, look here, verse 23, it includes the spirits of the righteous made perfect. Now, who are the spirits of the righteous made perfect? These are the saints who've already died. Made perfect refers to their what people call their full sanctification. And again, we'll talk about this at resurrection, what it means. But basically what it means is that we are going to be perfect at death. We're not going to battle with sin. We're not going to struggle with sin. All the imperfections of this world are going to be gone. When our bodies are going to be raised, that includes physically. We're going to be physically perfect, emotionally perfect, spiritually perfect, psychologically perfect. We're going to be perfect in every way. And so that's what he means here. We are made perfect. When he says the spirits of the righteous made perfect, it's proof that they exist in a disembodied state. And again, we'll talk about that next. When we talk about existence in the intermediate state, we're going to be disembodied. And that's, again, going to be temporary until resurrection. But the spirits of the righteous made perfect. It's clear that they're in a disembodied state. They're waiting for the resurrection bodies that we just read in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 is going to happen when Jesus Christ comes back. And they're fully existent. They're fully conscious. And they're in full fellowship with each other. To the general assembly, the church of the firstborn are enrolled in heaven, to God, the judge of all, and the spirits of the righteous made perfect. So again, there we see the full consciousness, the fellowship of the perfect spiritual existence after death. Let's see, one more. Let's look at one more. There's a couple more that we can look at, but let me just give you one more. 2 Corinthians. 2 Corinthians chapter 5. 2 Corinthians chapter 5. And look at verses 1. 2 Corinthians chapter 5. Look at verses... Let's see. Yeah, let's read. Let's start reading in verse 1. For we know that if the earthly tent, which is our house, is torn down, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. For indeed in this house we groan, longing to be clothed with our dwelling from heaven, inasmuch as we, having put it on, will not be found naked. For indeed, while we are in this tent, we groan, being burdened, because we do not want to be unclothed, but we want to be clothed, so that what is mortal will be swallowed up by life. Now he who prepared us for this very purpose is God, who gave to us the Spirit as a pledge. Therefore, being always of good courage, and knowing that while we are at home in the body, we are absent from the Lord, for we walk by faith and not by sight, we are of good courage. I say, and prefer rather to be absent from the body and to be at home with the Lord. Therefore, we also have as our ambition, whether at home or absent, to be pleasing to Him. So this is one of the clearest references, I believe, that we have in the New Testament to the intermediate state. They're described here as, again, being apart from the body. So we're disembodied spirits, but we're fully conscious and experiencing the passing of time, and we're anticipating our eternal state. We're anticipating heaven. And so he says, again, notice this in verse 6. While we're at home in the body, we are absent from the Lord, recognizing our present state, that our fellowship with Christ has its limits, but that's going to change, because he says in verse 8, we would prefer to be absent from the body and to be at home with the Lord. So when the body dies, we are going to be with the Lord. And so again, you see here the dual nature of our existence. We're body, we're spirit, and they can exist separately. And so when the body dies, we are then going to be at home. And there again is that prepositional phrase with, either with Christ, with the Lord in this case. We are with Him. And, it's the same sentiment that Paul expressed there in Philippians chapter 1. Boy, I'm just all torn. I don't know what to choose. It is far better to die. To die is gain, he said, because to depart means to be with Christ, which is far better. And so this is the same exact thing, same exact sentiment that he's expressing here. And again, he said, we prefer this. How could you prefer this if when you die, you have no conscious existence? How would that be preferable than living and having a conscious existence of fellowship? Doesn't make sense. So the only way this makes sense again is if there is continued conscious existence after we die. Okay, well, we looked at several verses there. Questions, comments, observations. All these texts combine to teach that, that inner man, that inner part of our nature, the spirit, the soul, whichever term you want to use, they can be interchangeable, survives death, survives the body. Body dies, it continues to exist in a complete state of consciousness. And it is something that we anticipate, but that state of consciousness, that being with Christ, which is far better, that paradise existence, we will still know that it is not the final state. There is still going to be anticipation for the full consummation of what's going to happen when Jesus Christ comes back. Questions, comments, observations? The floor is open to you. Okay. Let's start one thing here. Let's take about 15 more minutes. So 12:15, is that okay? To eat lunch? Okay, it's 12:04, 11 minutes. Let's look 11 more minutes. Let's start looking at, okay, what is our existence in the intermediate state going to be like? What is it going to be like? Well, that depends on whether we're lost or saved, obviously. And but there's certain characteristics of the intermediate life, the interim life, that are going to be shared by everybody who dies. And the main common characteristic of the interim state is what we've been saying, and that is our souls or our spirits, whatever term you choose, is going to exist without a physical body. In other words, we are going to be bodiless in the intermediate state. Now, that doesn't mean that we're not going to be people anymore. It doesn't mean that. angels are created spirit beings without physical bodies, but they're persons, they're people in every respect. Personhood is defined by God's nature, by the way. We're human people. Angels are spirit people. Personhood, you have consciousness, you have volition, you have the ability to, you have awareness, you can communicate, that is the nature of personhood. And God, that is determined by God, because God, we talk about God in three persons. God is a person. Personhood is defined by him. So it doesn't mean that, we're not people anymore. No, that's not what it means. We retain personhood. We retain our full personality. We retain our full identity that we had prior to death. When I die and my body is in the ground and my spirit goes to be with Christ, I'm still going to be Dan Chambers. I am. Lazarus was still Lazarus. The rich man was still the rich man. And so even though we're going to be apart from the physical bodies, we're going to have full personality, we're going to have personal identity. That's important to understand. It also is important to understand that it doesn't mean, being bodiless doesn't mean that we won't have form and that we won't have substance. Angels certainly aren't physical beings. They're a part of the spiritual dimension of creation. The Bible talks about, the New Testament talks about the creation and divides it into the visible and the invisible. There's two spheres of creation: the material visible world and the invisible spiritual sphere of creation. And so angels aren't physical beings, but and that's why they're undetectable and they're invisible to our physical senses. But in their own realm in which they live, the invisible universe, they have specific form and they have specific shape and they have specific consistency. They are beings of substance of some kind. It's some kind of spiritual substance, but make no mistake about it, they are, they certainly are beings of substance. And so just as angelic beings have specific forms and are of some substance, our bodiless spirits are going to have some kind of form. And we're not going to be some kind of formless energy field, floating around. And I remember an old Star Trek show where, it's kind of like a brains just communing with each other. I don't know what that looks like, but that's not what it's going to be. And so we're not only going to be just capable of mental experience because we don't have a body anymore. We're gonna have some kind of form. We're gonna have some kind of substance, and it's gonna probably mirror the form of our earthly body. And again, we could look at a couple of places. If we won't really take the time, but remember in 1 Samuel chapter 28 when Saul goes to the medium of Endor the day before he dies and gets killed in battle by the Philistines on Mount Gilboa. And Saul did the unthinkable there and consulted a medium. Sometimes she's called the Witch of Endor. And he wants Samuel's counsel. And so Samuel comes up and the medium of Endor freaks out, which I think shows that the medium of Endor did not really expect to see what she saw, but God can use anybody that he wants to accomplish his purposes. And so God was confronting Saul at that moment. Saul's hand was caught in the cookie jar. And he goes, and so Saul asked, "What's he look like?" And she described him, and he immediately recognizes who the description is of. So we can look at things like that. We think of things like Matthew 17, the transfiguration where Moses and Elijah appeared with Christ. And but Luke 16, again, clearly there's form and substance there of some sort. The bodies have been buried, but they retain their personal identity. They retain their full personality. And so there's form, there's substance. And again, it's probably going to mirror our physical body. Now, what that means for And that raises a bunch of questions. And I'll just kind of mention this real quick. Well, what kind of physical body? You know, the one where Frank was at the end of his life, 78 years old, and laying in a bed, or the baby who dies at 3 weeks, you know, is going to be romping around in spiritual diapers throughout the intermediate state. And I think that we can safely say no. That it's going to be the form of substance, the form of or the form rather of because the body is going to be raised perfectly and it's going to be transformed. And again, we'll talk more about this later, but I think it's fair to, you know, as we think about aging, for instance, is a consequence of sin. Aging, wearing out, dying and decaying. That aging is part of the ravages of the sin world that we live in now. And so all the effects in the redeemed state, all of the effects of sin are going to be done away with. All of them. And so I think it's fair to speculate that it would be the form in full, mature, young, mature adulthood. I don't know, you know, I would kind of almost envision, as we think about the prime of adulthood, you know, around, you know, we think of around that 30 kind of time frame, when the body is at its peak and strongest, and so that, you know, what kind of form will it look like? The one that, you know, when we died, and I think the answer to that would be no. I think it'll that a form in the intermediate state will be much like the form in the final state. Of course, the form in the final state will be our body as it's been transformed into perfection. Yes.
Looking along what you do, I've tried several times to put people's mind at rest about what we're talking about now. And we've raised the question, and if we're going to have a body that we can recognize, what about those bodies that appear in cremation?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the answer to that is God is big enough to take all of the molecules and put them back together. Because not only think about creation, just think about life. I mean, even people who were inhumed, people asked me before, where are all the millions and millions and millions of people that have died in the world? And the answer is, oh, they dissolved to dust long ago. Yeah. They're just, you know, I have a friend, the funeral director, Frank was cremated, and I want to be cremated. And cremation is becoming really, really popular in America. And a lot of people ask questions theologically about cremation. And the funeral director is a good friend of mine. He's an elder of a sister congregation that's like 5-minute drive from our building. And just a wonderful man. Wendell Bird's his name. And Wendell, as we were talking about it, he said, yeah, Dan, I tell people when they ask about cremation, he said, listen, there are 3 ways that I can handle the body of your loved one. He said, but what's going to happen is ultimately they're all going to be in the same place. They're all going to, it's just, depending on what I do, it will just, all it changes is the time for it to get there. He said, you know, if we embalm, he said, it's eventually going to go back to dust. It'll just take longer. And he said, if we don't embalm and bury it out, it's just going to go back to dust. It's just going to take longer. And he says, and if I cremate, it's going back to dust. It's just going to take a shorter time. He says the end result is going to always be the same. And so you think about all the people that have died before, everybody eventually goes back to dust. And you think about people who are like at 9/11 in America, that I mean, these people in the Twin Towers, they're evaporated. Well, what happens to them? Are they going to miss eternal life? Nah, God's bigger than that. No matter where my molecules are scattered, God is big enough to put them back together. God is amazing. So I say that because, yes, people want reassurance, and I always reassure them because this is absolutely true. God is big enough One of my favorite passages that I go to in a situation like this, brother, is Ezekiel 37. Was that what you were going to say?
Yeah.
I thought you were okay. I was going to get to you right after I said that. It's so good. As you know, God takes the prophet there and says, shows him this valley of decomposing. It says the bones that were still there were very dry, which means they were in an advanced state of decomposition. And he says, "Can these bones live?" And Elisha says, he goes, "Oh God, you know." That's a good answer. Oh, in other words, if you want them to live, they'll live. And God said, "Prophesy." And he did as he was told. And as he did, man, I can just picture the scene, that just macabre silence of that pile of advanced, bones in a state of advanced decomposition. They begin to rattle and move. And suddenly they come together, and it's not just a pile of decomposing bones, but it's skeletons. And as he keeps watching it, suddenly they begin to thicken as muscle begins to cover the bones, and then flesh. And suddenly he's looking there, and it's a pile of bodies. And then God says, prophesy and say, "Come from the four winds, O breath, and breathe on these slain that they may live." And he did. And suddenly standing before him was a great army. God is big enough to do. God spoke everything. Think about this. God spoke everything into existence out of nothing. Creation wasn't a generation where that meaning, God didn't create what exists out of something that was pre-existing. And it wasn't a formation where he takes some big blob and then form. It was originally its creation out of nothing. He created the material, and then he formed and filled it. God is, the omnipotence of God. So yes, when people are concerned about, you think of, again, like things like 9/11, the Twin Towers, warfare, the people have been just obliterated, or just through natural causes over the centuries, going back to dust. What happens? God's big enough to put them all back together. Yep. Okay, listen, that was a great place to stop. When we come back, we're going to continue to talk about what is our existence going to be like in the final state, and then we're going to move on to judgment. Judgment. We're talking about resurrection and judgment. I probably won't get all that today, but okay, let's adjourn for lunch, shall we?